maybe it's just as well a lot of your classmates aren't here, because the subject I'm about to talk about, I have to say I feel extremely uncomfortable talking about. However, before I get into the subject of Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, before I get to them, there's something I think I really ought to go over first, because I'll keep referring back to this part of the lecture. If you turn, if those of you who are following along the book, to page 110 and page 111 and page 112, family relationships. Now, I was asked beginning of class, will I be asking anything from these little insects? In this case, I will. About the family. Here's what I remember about the Greek family. In general, the Greeks believed that their women were inferior and should stay at home, and they should bear children. Greek women were expected particularly to bear male children because the males inherited the property, carried on the family name, and etc., etc. And what they would try to do in this was to go on for the next 1,000 or more years. They would try to marry a woman who had a lot of brothers, believing that a woman who had a lot of brothers would be more likely to produce a male heir. Now, folks, if you're looking at me kind of strange, I understand. In your biology classes, you were probably taught that the man determines the sex of the offspring. The woman has nothing to do with it, but they did not know that, so they assumed the woman determined the sex of the offspring. So they would try to marry a woman who had a lot of brothers, or who had maybe a lot of uncles, but a woman who produced a family with a lot of men, and hoped that it would help them produce a male heir. Women were expected to stay at home, take care of the house, or supervising the slaves who did the actual work. Now, in Sparta, because of the situation that went on in Sparta, things were different. The men were expected to live in the barracks till they were 30, but oftentimes couples married long before they were 30, but the men were expected to live in the barracks, so women had a lot more freedom, and they exercised it. The women in Sparta had more freedom than they did anywhere else in Greece, owing to the fact that their men were away much of the time, and also, of course, the men were away a lot of the time fighting, or they were away in the barracks. So the women had more freedom. Aristotle noticed this also. You see halfway down the right column there on page 111. Now, folk, I have to mention this. I mean, this is a big part of Greek culture. I don't mean to offend anybody, and I don't mean to make any kind of moral judgments, but nevertheless, here's the situation. The Greek men practiced homosexuality of a type that even in 21st century America we have still declared to be illegal. Men with young boys. They believed that they would introduce these boys to the adult world if they did this. So they would catch or you might say entice a young boy that they liked, and teach him, particularly the art of politics or the art of war. And this was a way that they propagated their culture from one generation to another. In other words, it wasn't just father and son. It was male lover with a young male. Now, this went on in the upper classes. In other words, usually an upper class male and an upper class aristocrat who did this. Earlier, the authors would say that they don't know if this extended to the lower classes or not, but it was the ideal, considered the ideal among the upper classes. And a typical Greek aristocrat, I mean, he'd marry, have legitimate children to carry on the family name, and he's thought nothing unusual about having a male lover, or maybe several of them, to go along to be part of his life also. All right, that's the subject I will be referring back to this as I go along with these men I'm about to talk about, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Hi. Socrates. We do not know much about his early life, and we have nothing that he wrote that came down to us. Everything we know about him was written by other people, most notably Plato, Themistocles, and Thucydides. I believe it. I know that Plato and Thucydides are right, but a lot of what we know about him comes from them. He appears to have been a highly intelligent, very gifted man. By trade, he might have possibly been a glassblower. He was either from the middle class or from the lower class, but apparently he was not from the upper class. Now, what did he teach? Among other things, he taught self-examination. He's famous for the saying, know thyself, as if it's possible to do so. He's also famous for the saying, the unexamined life is not worth living. Now, folks, it's just been a few days ago that I heard someone say that persons who spend time examining themselves are very selfish, that you really cannot know yourself, and self-examination is utter futility. I'll let you to decide for yourself. Now, here we come to a part of what Socrates said that might not, I mean, to the modern mind, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, quite frankly, but to their mind. He believed in the question and answer method of teaching, which is what we still use today. In other words, the tests that I give you are supposed to be part of the learning process. You learn a lot from taking tests. But he believed that the answer to every question resided somewhere inside a person, and all it took was someone else to keep asking the question, and eventually the answer would come out. Now, folks, I doubt that any of you know how tightly the nuts on your cylinder head should be tightened. I don't know. If you don't know, don't worry about it. Somebody has to know that. I mean, it's very important, because if you tighten the nuts down wrong, tighten one down tighter than another, eventually your head's going to work its way loose and come off. Every mechanic supposedly knows that. But if somebody would ask you, no matter how many times they ask you, unless that knowledge is inside your head somewhere, you're not going to be able to answer. Socrates did not realize that there are certain kinds of knowledge that simply cannot be found by searching inside yourself. You cannot find the answer to that. For how high should the pressure on your tires be? Well, hey, that's printed on every tire that's sold these days. That's right. But I can't tell you what the pressure on my tire should be, but I know where to look. And when I decide to pump up my tire, hey, all I got to do is consult the tire itself or consult the manual. But again, I don't know that off the top of my head. And all the question you can do is not going to get it out of me. He believed that question and answer was the way to... Now, he also twisted almost everything the Athenians believed up to that time. In what way? Well, he would catch people on their way to court. He'd start questioning them, why are you going to court? What is your case? And he would try to convince everybody that his or her case, or his case, probably most of the time, was the worst case. That the other fellow had a better case than, the other fellow has a better case than you have, and you're always on the wrong side of the issue. After a time, the people of Athens began to resent that, because you can't tell a man who's just simply really seemingly been hurt. It's hard to tell a man who's been hurt and thinking, hey, I've got a grievance. Hey, I've got something to tell you, you have no grievance. The other fellow was right, you're wrong. Socrates would try to, you might say, turn the world upside down. There have been many stories told about Socrates, and some of them we have a really hard time determining how true they are, because as in the case of a lot of philosophers, you might say spurious story. In other words, there's what the original sources said, and then what was said by people who came after. There have been stories, for instance, Socrates believed in one God. But lately, we've done some more research and find we cannot find that in the writings of Plato or Thucydides. Not for sure, even though he did question Greek religion. Now, Socrates believed that he could, if you talked to him long enough, he could help you replace your bad thoughts with better thoughts, have a more positive outlook, an upward outlook. He also dealt with the subject of morality. And here we get back to what I was talking about earlier. It is known that Socrates had temptations toward young boys, which he might possibly have overcome. How? Well, first of all, he married and he had 3 sons. But second of all, now, I'm about to say, I mean, you're all adults, I hope you can handle it. In my research of Socrates, and I've been to 100 websites, I guess, that deal with Socrates over the past 15 years. I started researching in 1998, 2 years before I started working here. But anyway, only 1 out of every 4 web pages are going to mention what I'm about to tell you. But I think it's important that I give this to you. Socrates claimed that he was buddies with a demon, a spirit entity, and this demon kept him away from the boys and helped keep the boys away from him. And this demon influenced him toward a higher standard of morality. Now again, any of you can handle that any way you want. If you don't believe what I'm saying, research it yourself. Go to the web and look up Socrates and go on into more than 100 websites, of which several of them will tell you something like what I've just told you. He said he once visited this demon in his palace, and this demon lived in a super magnificent palace and was attended to by several other demon servants. Now, I want to state 90 to 95% of the world's population down through time have believed that there are spirit entities, sometimes called genie, sometimes called demons, sometimes called by various other names. 90 to 95% of what people have believed this. So in that regard, Socrates was a little different from anyone else. And if these genie or demons, what they call, go around and whisper things into your ear or implant suggestions, Socrates believed that his demon buddy would plant suggestions into his mind. Now, time went on. Socrates turned 70 years old, and eventually, like I said, the people got tired of him. He was brought before the Council of 500, otherwise called the Ecclesia, and tried on the charge of corrupting the youth.
He was tried.
Yeah, he was tried before the council. Now, in other words, he actually underwent 2 trials. The first trial was to determine whether or not he was guilty. The second trial was to determine whether or not he got the death penalty. So he underwent 2 trials. Now, about the charge of corrupting the youth, let me tell you something. I mean, being a parent myself, every parent almost is concerned that the next generation develop his or her values. And you try to impart these values to the next generation. Well, the people of Athens began to think that, hey, he is turning the youth against our gods. He's turning the youth against our most cherished beliefs. And in his defense, Socrates said, well, hey, look at Plato. I mean, his star pupil was Plato. Have I corrupted Plato? Nevertheless, I mean, now, let me hasten to state, they accuse him of corrupting the youth spiritually and philosophically, mentally, not sexually. Again, as far as we know, Socrates' personal morality was above reproach or above fault. Socrates scoffed at the assembly. Now, I'm not giving accurate figures because I don't know, I've seen it, but the first vote, the vote that he was guilty, was something like 260, 240. In other words, just a really close vote. But when he learned that he'd been declared guilty by the Ecclesia, the assembly, the Council of 500, call it what you will, he became very, you might say, arrogant, scoffed at the assembly, ridiculed him. What right do you have to judge me? So the second time the assembly voted on a death penalty, they voted like 400 to 100 to have him executed. You know, basically, he might have gotten away with a lighter sentence if he had shown respect for the assembly, but he didn't. The result was he was executed. Actually, on the appointed day, he drank hemlock, like he was told to do by assembly. The story goes he cheerfully drank the hemlock. His attitude was, hey, I'm 70 years old. I already feel myself declining. He was still running foot races at 70. He said, at 70, men whom I formerly could beat now beat me in wrestling matches. And yes, he was still wrestling. He said, men whom I formerly could beat in wrestling matches now beat me. And all I have to look forward to is declining physical and mental health. So within the next 10 years, I'll lose control of my bowel and bladder function. I'll probably lose my ability to walk. I'll start off walking with a cane and then have to walk or lose my ability to walk entirely. He said, I have really nothing to look forward to in this life. So as far as death goes, he said, death will either make me a god or make me, make me totally annihilated. I don't know which, but I'm going to die anyway. So what's the big deal? Some of his friends got together a plot to have him escape to Sparta where that he would have been safe. He said, no, such a deed would be wrong. And he refused to go along with it. So on a given day, he cheerfully drank the hemlock and died. And no sooner was he dead than the people of Athens realized, hey, we've killed a really good man. We have made a martyr out of him, and they began to make an icon out of him, as was the case of so many people down through the ages who have been unjustly killed. They made an icon. Now, one of Socrates' more famous quotes, I went to a webpage one time, and this webpage was put up by a professor who is an expert on Socrates. He said, everywhere I go, when people find out I'm an expert on Socrates, he asked me, did Socrates really say that give people too much freedom and they'll demand tyranny? So he put on a webpage what Socrates said. And he goes something like this. He said, the Athens I see today, the wives do not obey their husbands. He said, even the animals do not obey their owners. The dogs don't come when they're called. The mules don't move when they're told to. The horses don't obey their masters. And the sons and daughters don't obey their fathers. And the people don't obey the government. He said, we're living in a world of chaos. And he longed for some kind of order. And he has been accused of, among other things, of siding with Sparta. Now, I want to state this. A lot of American professors and liberals sided with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And a lot of Soviets liked the United States. You think that everything is green on the other side, but a lot of Soviet people who came over here to escape Soviet oppression wound up going back. They said, I can't stand Western decadence, the most famous being Alexander Solzhenitsyn. If Socrates had gone to Sparta, perhaps he might not have liked it. All right.